Hello and welcome to the Life Illuminated podcast. I'm Maggie Kelly, your host, and today I have the pleasure and the honor of welcoming Brian Sachetta to the show. Brian is an author and he's in the mental health space, and his mission is to help people with anxiety and depression. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, Maggie. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, boy, that's a loaded topic, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is. There's a lot to talk about within the subject. And just to throw out a quick stat, I think the latest numbers are that 1 in 5 Americans deal with a serious psychiatric condition every year. It's a big, I don't want to say market because that sounds bad. It's an important subject that affects a lot of people.
Yeah, where do you think the anxiety and depression stems from or originates from?
Yeah, there's a lot of different factors. I have two books. So one is on anxiety, one is on depression. In the second book, I look at depression specifically and I say, hey, there are different inputs to depression, right? So there are biological factors, as in how do you move your body? What are your genetics? There are psychological factors. What thoughts spin around in your head every day? What beliefs do you hold? And there are social factors. So it's where do you live? How do you grow up? What kind of relationships do you have? So a lot of those things can come together and conspire to bring about anxiety or depression, right? In that second book, I was looking more specifically at depression, but I think we can say that about either condition. If we start with anxiety, because the numbers seem to show that anxiety is more prevalent in our society, we could talk about a lot of different things, but I think the most important one, right, is just the general sense of unease and uncertainty in the world. And where does that come from, right? One thing that I like to point to is in saying that even though, let's say, our parents, maybe our grandparents or great grandparents' generations, the world has always been uncertain. What's the difference now, right? At this moment, we're not in the middle of World War II or something like that. So, what's the difference there? And what I would say is that, again, the world has always been uncertain, but today we have social media, we have the internet, we are always connected to our devices. And so, that uncertainty that has kind of always been there, maybe it's better or worse today versus the World War II generation. I don't know for sure. What I can say the difference is that we hear about these things all the time in all these different places. And so when you're reminded of those stressors again and again and again, it would make sense that across the population, you would see larger levels of anxiety.
Well, and then we have the responsibility as human beings to help ourselves heal from these conditions. I mean, it's up to us to turn the device off.
Yeah, it is. I guess the difficulty, right, is obviously we have to bring or we have to try to bring some agency to all of this stuff. To your point of, hey, when applicable, turn the device off or whatever. I guess my point about the franticness of society is that that's kind of the macro level backdrop, right? So every person finds themselves in a new world, in a new situation, let's say the World War II generation, where there are larger and more powerful forces that they have to deal with, right? So if your main stressor comes from this one particular place and you can easily identify it and therefore you can easily shut it off, then it's probably going to be easier to manage, right? But the world is very frantic these days. We have social media, we have the internet, we have our cell phones, we got the TVs, computers, and all that, right? And then you talk about lots of different other concepts, economic uncertainty, geopolitical conflicts, and whatnot. I think a lot of people feel overwhelmed, right, by that stress. There's so much of it, it comes from everywhere. I never know exactly. I might be scrolling Twitter one day and be having a good time. And then the next day, I might be seeing all these scary headlines and freaked out. And so I think a lot of people are on edge, just kind of saying to themselves, I don't know where to turn. If I shut off this one source, it's still going to come from some other place. So how do I deal with that?
Well, and as a meditation teacher and a spiritual counselor, life coach, and energy healer, my go to answer is quiet your mind, right? And how do you quiet your mind? Well, you start by turning all that off. You have to be committed to healing yourself. And I think a lot of our go to is go take a medicine, go take a Prozac, go take a Wellbutrin and an anti-anxiety med, and it'll all go away. When in fact, really, we're not really addressing the root cause. And the root cause is what you just said, is all of the craziness in the world, which I don't believe was any less crazy in my parents' generation. It's just right in front of us now. Let's just take, for instance, for our listeners, we are recording the day before the 2024 election. So today, I even have a client who's coming tomorrow for energy healing, and he's nervous about coming tomorrow because once he leaves here, he knows he's gonna be glued to the television set for election results, and I suggested he not come tomorrow. If that's what you're going to do after you begin your healing process with me, you will undo everything we do in 2 hours together and perhaps make it even more amplified. So we as human beings have a huge responsibility to care for our own mental health and well-being. But unfortunately, I think the other piece to what we're talking about is society's natural, instinctual, it seems, go to is take a pill.
Yeah, it's a complicated subject, right? Everybody's got a slightly different approach. My approach is you have to do whatever you need to do to feel better, right? The goal is to feel better. And if we go into the details of that and we say, hey, I took a bunch of medication and it helps me feel better in the moment. But then if it's Xanax or something, right? And when that wears off, I'm still incredibly anxious. Then I would say that you haven't met that goal yet of feeling better. You got a little bit of the way there, but you haven't resolved that all the way. So my practice is basically saying, hey, there's all sorts of different tools that we can leverage, medication being one of them. Everybody's going to have a different opinion on what tools to use and whether they're comfortable with them or not. My philosophy is we got to figure out which ones work best for that person. And at the end of the day, right, however we get there, we want to feel better, right? You think about anxiety, you think about depression. We say, okay, what is anxiety? Anxiety is basically feeling afraid all the time. It's something a little bit more of projected out into the future. It's a different fear than being in a haunted house, for example. But it's still that feeling of fear, just prolonged and probably more uncertain, right? So nobody to feel that way. So when I say we want to feel better, right? We want to feel at calm. We want to feel at ease, at peace, and all that stuff. When we're depressed, right? We're basically feeling helpless and hopeless. And I mean, that's a horrible place to be. So if I zoom out all the way and be as broad as possible, that is the goal, right? Is let's try to feel better. And then from there, it's which of these tactics resonate with you. I think one thing that you touched upon that's really important, right, is you had said we have to do the self healing, we have to go within and kind of find that inner peace. I really like that because it aligns with kind of what I just said, but also you think about, okay, there's all these things out there, as in out there in the world. There is war and there's economic uncertainty and there is elections and there's job interviews and whether or not you think you'll hold your job and put food on the table and all that. That stuff is external. And I'm really, I want to stress, I'm not downplaying any of that. But there's the stress and then there is the reaction to the stress, right? So if you think about what all those things have in common is you. You are a part of that formula, right? So in some ways, if you think of this as people will sometimes say, there's somebody who's wearing rose tinted glasses, right? And the idea there is basically saying that when you change the lens through which you look at the world, that world actually changes. So if you are able to do that inner work to say, I am less stressed now, then you look at all these stressors. I'm not going to say that they're just going to, what's the right word, evaporate, but you will see them in a less stressful fashion. So I do love your point in the sense we have to do that inner work to make it so that our view of the world is one that is less stressful. And then the things that we're looking at are not mirroring the wrong state back to us. And another way of saying that, right, is I think I heard this on a podcast recently. Somebody said, let's just say that the world is more stressful than ever. I'm not saying that that's a fact, but maybe, right? It's something that we could postulate or whatever. Let's say then that the storm of stress out in the world is larger than ever. The larger the storm that is out there, the larger the eye of the storm, if we use this analogy of a hurricane. So to your point of doing that inner work is as life gets more stressful, as things become harder to manage, it is more important for us to go inside and do that inner de-stressing, doing that inner work. I think that meditation is one of the main tools here, right? Because how else do you really de-stress yourself? I mean, you can hang out with friends, you can go running, go work out. But again, with this larger storm of stress out in the world, I don't want to say responsibility, but there's definitely a stronger impetus on us to go within and get more of that de-stressing effect. So that way, again, we change our view of the world.
One of the things that I recommend to some of my students is to practice what I call mindful consumption. And I'm not talking about food. I am talking about all five senses, to be able to step back and look at your life from a consumptive point of view. What am I consuming? Both what am I hearing? What am I seeing, allowing myself to see? Am I watching the news every night? Am I scrolling through endless times on CNN? What am I eating? Of course. What am I listening to in terms of, do I listen to really difficult music, rap, for instance, or heavy metal or other kinds of music that would cause my whole autonomic nervous system to kick into gear? What am I feeling? Am I spending any time just relaxing? Do I go out to the beach and put my toes in sand? Do I put my feet in the water? Do I smell the ocean? Am I lighting maybe some candle or some incense or some scent that really appeals to my sensitivities? And then, of course, what am I eating? Because all of it, body, mind, and spirit, go together. And if we can sort of take a little bit of an inventory of what am I consuming, those sorts of things that we consume are contributing to the anxiety and the stress that we're all under on a day-to-day basis. And if we're not paying attention, then all we're doing is getting held captive by the world out there. And nothing about the world out there is going to change my internal condition.
Yeah, I mean, we're hitting the same note again in different ways, which is really, really important statement to make. I would almost say folks talk about a social media diet, right? So I think you said mindful consumption. Thinking about, let me put it this way, right? Is we often adapt to our circumstances. So if that means, hey, 1 week was really stressful at work, or it's been a few months that have been stressful, we tend to sometimes just put the blinders on, put our heads down, and keep going. We could use that same sort of analogy or whatever in different areas of our lives. So let's just say, for example, your friends are always texting about these new TV shows, and you're like, oh, I got to keep up with these shows because I want to stay up to date with the conversation and connect with my friends and all that. And again, let's say there's a million different examples. What can happen is 6 months go by, you find yourself in a general life situation where you're like, I'm stressed out all the time. I'm reading these things that don't feed my mind in a positive fashion and all that. And eventually, either you hit a brick wall and something needs to change. I'm going to make that change right now. Or maybe you listen to a podcast, this one, and we say, hey, here is an invitation to do a little bit of an inventory, right? To say to yourself, what are the habits that I'm running on a daily basis? And I know that not everybody is in the position to only do things that they enjoy, right? We have to work, we have to make ends meet and all that, but maybe there's a couple small things that you can change. For example, I have a little bit of OCD myself, and there's times where I'm listening to all these audiobooks because I want to get a lot of information, stay up on various subjects, whether it's mental health or finance or whatever. And I'll be stressing myself out trying to listen to these audiobooks and sometimes some podcasts. And then I have to slow myself down and be like, do I even enjoy this, right? I know I want the information and I know it seems cool to be informed, but at a base level, am I enjoying this? And if the answer is no, then there's some work to do. And I have to be honest and say that I have had to make those choices or think about that in the recent past.
And what you're hitting on is awareness, right? Is we need as human beings to have some awareness about our habits and our ways of managing our lives in the world. For example, I imagine that a bulk of our listeners at this very moment wake up every morning and their phone is next to the bed. Now, so the first thing I'm going to do when I wake up is roll over and start scrolling. I can't think of a worse way to start your day, right? So there's a really easy habit to break. Yes, it sounds old school to go to CVS or whatever pharmacy you have locally and buy one of those old analog clocks or a little digital clock to have by your bed as your alarm, because I get the excuse that it's my alarm. Well, it doesn't have to be, right? And so there's one tiny little thing you can do to take charge of your own mental health and well-being from the beginning of your day.
Yeah, it's such astute point. Here's an argument, and I'm in total agreement with you. I to approach these things from almost as if I'm a salesperson and I'm handling objections, right? So if somebody says to me, "It's my alarm. I can't afford to not do the alarm thing," whatever. I mean, you handled that one already in the sense that I have one of those digital clocks. Uh, I don't know what the price is today, but I bought that clock probably 4 or 5 years ago. I got it on Amazon. It was $11. So I understand maybe not every single person has $11, but it's not a several $100 purchase here. I think most people could probably afford that. The other piece being, and here's the real objection handle is somebody says to me, no, I feel more comfortable using the phone or whatever it is, and I don't want to buy this alarm clock. I don't want to have an additional thing. I would say to them, guess what? If you are using your alarm, and a lot of people will sometimes they'll turn the phone and put it in nightstand mode or whatever, so they see basically the digital clock on their phone. I would say if you have that set up, the screen on your device is in use now an extra 10 hours a day. And that actually depletes the actual battery health. Not just I'm using more battery, but your battery is going to die sooner in its life cycle than it would normally. So you're actually saving yourself money if you're like, hey, I'm going to use this other clock and then I'm gonna have my phone shut off for 10 hours, or at least the screen is shut off. You're not going to have to replace your battery as quickly because it's usually a 2 year life cycle on the battery. A lot of folks are like, hey, the battery's getting bad. Let me just go buy a new iPhone. And this is my final point is how much a new iPhone costs? It's $1,000. So on the cost piece, right, is I like to push people a little bit and be like, is this a rational argument or is there something else going on here? So there's the finance piece, but then there is also what you said. If you can put yourself in a position where you're not waking up every day, opening your phone, seeing all these notifications, getting inundated with these requests and Slack messages and texts and all that, start your day off slow, go for a walk, maybe get a cup of coffee, cup of tea, or whatever it is. When you have acclimated, when your body is already like, hey, we're ready to start the day, a half hour or an hour later, then take a look at the phone. You'll reap some benefits mentally as a result of that.
For me, the argument is the blue light that it is emitted from the phone. When we are, especially in the dark, when we are turning the phone on and looking at that screen, you're automatically waking up your brain when your brain is actually trying to slow down and go to sleep. So, what you're really doing is kickstarting your brain again and again and again every time you pick up that phone and look at that screen. One of the recommendations I have for all of my students is to turn all notifications off. Turn the notifications off, turn the push notifications that come from wherever you have them set up. Even you can change the color settings on what you're looking at to black and white. There are plenty of research studies that talk about this, the blue light and what happens to our brains when we continually use a phone overnight or first thing in the morning. So if you're trying to slow down or settle your brain down, one of the worst things you can do is start scrolling on your way to bed or as the last thing you do on the way to bed. I, for one, have zero notifications going. I don't know if someone has texted me unless I go and deliberately open my text app and look. Because in my world, and I'm going to guess in most people's world, I'm okay. There's nothing that urgent for me. I know where my children are. As long as I know that my children are safe, I don't need to respond to every single email or text message or news clip that comes across my face all day long. So that's one of the big things for me is turn the notifications off. I go the extra step. I actually turn the ringer off. I have no vibration, no ding, ding, ding all day long. I have no interruption to my day with that device because in my mind, our phones are the biggest culprit to keeping our minds overactive.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of great points there. I was kind of laughing to myself as you talked about the black and white setting. So on my screen here, it's an accessibility mode, I think. I can swipe down from the top, hit a little button, and turn the color on or off. One of my friends showed me that. And to your point, right, is not only I think it changes some of the blue light, and obviously you want to use a night shift mode on the device as well, but I don't know if that gets rid of all blue light or not. For me, the main thing is just making it so that the grayness makes me want to put the phone down, right? It's like, oh, the excitement is kind of gone, but that's good because I don't want to be glued to my phone all day, every day. And I think for folks who are listening to this, there's no hard and fast rule here, right? I think you have to figure out what works best for you. At the same time, let's just say having the phone on all the time, having the colors on all the time, having all notifications and lots of notifications on all the time is probably not a formula for success, but you have to figure out within that gradient, where do you want to land? Because maybe somebody's, hey, I have this really important conversation and so that they need updates from. So maybe they say, I'm going to turn on do not disturb, but in the most recent iOS settings, you can make it so that certain apps, certain people, and certain phone calls can break through that mode. So then you only get certain notifications, and you make it work for you.
Yeah, and just to your point, I have a new you can put your phone in focus mode. You can add a focus to it. I have added meditation as a focus mode. So every night at 7 p.m., my phone goes into focus so I can meditate. Same thing every morning, 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. goes into focus mode so that no one can disturb me. But what you're alluding to, what I think is a really salient point for everyone listening is that we have control over the interruptions that we are receiving. And if we understand that we have allowed ourselves to be sort of quote unquote taken over by social media, social, all of that, all our phones and then all of it. If we understand that we have control over that, I think we'll have some facility over our own mental health and well being, at least to a tiny degree. It doesn't help to, especially as a meditation teacher, one of the things I hate to remind us of is that 95% of our thinking is repeat thinking, is perseverating, is ruminating thinking, which also alludes to the other side. That means that only 5% of what we're thinking about is original. Now, that's pretty frightening if you think about that for a minute. So, what is it that we're perseverating about? What is it that we're ruminating about? And I think that's the bigger crux underneath all of what we're talking about is where have we been wounded and those wounds have yet to be healed. And whether you see a life coach, me, or a therapist or whatever, the key is to get to the root of that so you can stop ruminating about things that happened to you when you were 5. And I'm not being insensitive to your traumas and dramas because all of that is important and has made you who you are today, right? But what we want to be doing instead of ruminating is we want to start right where you are today and move forward and create the future for you, as opposed to starting where you are today and going backwards and dredging up all the dramas and traumas and re-traumatizing you, which is one reason why I am not a big, huge proponent of psychotherapy personally, because I don't believe in re-traumatizing somebody. But I do believe in healing the wounds. And that's why I'm an energy healer, right? Because those wounds stick and stay as toxic residue on your energetic body. And if we don't clear and clean those wounds from the energetic body, they will manifest as disease. And that's just the way that is. Most people don't think that, don't believe in that. They may think I'm kind of nutty, but a shaman doesn't believe that there is disease. They believe that there are sick people and sick in this way, where we have not healed those wounds from ourselves. And as long as we have it, then we're setting up ourselves to stay in a stress mode and to set ourselves up for disease. And for the most part, all of us are living in fight, flight, and freeze on a daily basis. And for those of you listening, the fight, flight, and freeze, I'm sure you already know, is the stress response. It's our autonomic nervous system going on rapid fire all day long. It's impossible for us to live from our heart center if we're living constantly and chronically in survival. And if our autonomic nervous system is always on high alert, hypervigilant, waiting for the next shoe to drop, waiting for the next fire to put out, we are in a self-centered bubble. When we're in stress, we are stuck in our own mired world. It's impossible for us to think about people out here when we're stuck in worrying about our own survival. That's just a human condition, right? That's just the basic survival instinct we all have. So, what is it that you are, as a listener, living in stress about? If you can identify that, then you're one leg up, a huge leg up on being able to help settle that anxiety, because the anxiety is coming from survival, from living in that survival. Like you said, living in a state of fear. That's what anxiety is.
Yeah. Oh man. I wish we had many more hours to keep going on this thread. You brought up so many good points there, right? So you had mentioned sometimes the difficulty of psychotherapy and the fact that we have to meet you where you are and find a way to help you move past your previous hurts and traumas and all that. My branded way of saying that is we want you to feel better. We don't want you to live in stress all the time. We don't want you to live in fear all the time. To your point, there's some teeter-totter of you can focus on these things far too much and make them worse. You cannot focus on them at all, have them go basically, let's say, repress them or have them go untouched for a long time. And you can kind of suppress that into the body. And that's kind of the trauma response, right? Is basically something horrible happens to you or something scary happens to you. You don't know how to make sense of it. You push it down years later after it has festered in the body for a long time. All of a sudden, you're running these patterns in your mind, and maybe you realize it, maybe you don't. If you do, then that's a chance for you to process that, move forward and make sense of it, and take whatever healing steps you need to take. If you don't, then hey, maybe you just feel horrible all the time, and that's what calls you to go to therapy or work with an energy healer or something like that. What I really wanted to bring up here, right, is the challenge. So you had said, right, we don't want to re-traumatize ourselves. I love that. Here's how I look at that in my own context, right? Is there are a lot of times, I mean, this is just a pattern. I will go on job interviews. I'll go on dates with women that I'm interested in. There's a time where I went skydiving and all these things were scary to me, right? And my brain says, go into those moments, picture yourself in them, picture yourself succeeding. And what happens very quickly is it becomes that rumination that you talked about. And that rumination then creates more uncertainty and more stress and more fear. And so there's a lot of folks, right? There's kind of the law of attraction space. People will say, no, you actually need to visualize yourself doing that thing. And then once you successfully execute that in your mind, you'll be able to make happen what you want to make happen in your life. I have run that pattern so many times and for so many years in my life that there was a certain point, and I'm not saying I'm proficient with it, but I've gotten a lot better with it, where I had been doing that for 10 years. And I just sat there and I have been banging my head against the wall for 10 years trying to run this ruminative strategy, thinking as though there's going to be an exit out of this. There's going to be another point at which I emerge from this. I've thought it all the way through and I finally figured it out. Guess what? For a lot of people, and I'd say pretty much most people, this is a common pattern. That rumination doesn't get you anywhere. And so when you had said, we don't want to re-traumatize ourselves, right? Is that teeter-totter is, okay, sometimes it can be beneficial to be like, hey, I have a presentation that I'm giving tomorrow. I'm afraid to give that presentation. So the teeter-totter is me thinking about the presentation, reciting my lines, and by reciting my lines and understanding my content better, I will feel more confident that I'll get up there and I will deliver those lines. The other side of the teeter-totter is I'm going to go stew on that presentation again and again and again and create all that stress within my body. And I will just say loosely re-traumatize myself. So you have to figure out in your own mind, where is that line? Where is that gauge between really helpful or kind of helpful and downright detrimental? And so that is a challenge. The mind plays tricks on us, and it's often hard to know, is what my mind telling me, is this really important? Is this really going to move me forward, or is it not? Because if you go all the way back and you think about the structures of the brain, evolutionary psychology, and all that, right? The brain is really just designed to keep us alive. It could be that maybe there is some traumatic thing that has gone unresolved, and our ruminations and our fear is a product of that. And maybe we have to go resolve that. However, it could also just be that there's some scary and unknown thing in front of us, and our brains see that uncertainty and are like, run the stress response, run the stress response, run the stress response, just trying to help us survive, not really realizing that that doesn't actually help us that much in our modern world, right? If you're in front of a lion and the stress response kicks in, it's a horrible situation to be in, but at the very least, your body is flooded with adrenaline and cortisol and you're out of there immediately. However, when you're like, I have this quarterly business review at work a month from now, and it's going to make or break my career, there's no running from that, right? So there's just the stress response. So you have to figure out, do I listen to this stress response, or do I just try to ignore it the best I can and make sense of it in saying that it's just a natural part of how these things go? The more that I go back to that awareness and inner de-stressing, the easier this is going to go for me.
Well, and you bring up a couple of really great points. A simple thought will send us into fight, flight, and freeze. It doesn't have to be an event. It doesn't have to be someone holding you up at the grocery store or cutting you off on the freeway. It doesn't have to be that dramatic. It can simply be a rumination that you just described, that sends our autonomic nervous system into fight, flight, and freeze. All kinds of things happen. Not just the heart rate goes up, the blood pressure goes up, we might begin to perspire, but also our digestion slows when we're in fight, flight, and freeze. And the reason that it does is your body doesn't care if whether or not you digest your lunch, if there's a lion in front of you. So your body knows naturally to settle down the digestive response when you're stressed. Your insulin stores go nuts. All of the regular hormones that we have that keep us happy, the hormones that keep us from being depressed, all of those hormones go down and go crazy when we're in the fight, flight, and freeze. So, those of you who are suffering from insomnia or diabetes or heart issues or any of those sorts of things, a lot of that has to do with you being under chronic stress. Your system can only handle so much at one time. The problem with the fight, flight, and freeze response is once it kicks into gear, you could have one stressful event. Then during your day, there's another one, and then another one. And the problem with that is it takes your system about 4 to 5 hours to begin with to settle down from the very first stress response. So you can understand how your physiology is always revved up if you don't figure out how to settle it down. And this is where also it's important to remember too that if you're someone who meditates, what ends up happening as you meditate is some of these old wounds and those things that are unresolved that you've suppressed or repressed down into your psychological basement for however many years you've done that, all of those things are going to start to bubble up to the surface once you quiet your mind. You can't escape yourself. That's my point there. And so the question is, how committed are you to managing your own anxiety and depression beyond pharmaceuticals? In my world, pharmaceuticals don't exist, not for any of it, right? And they don't have to. I do understand the place that they have in our society and the place they have for people who are really psychologically in trouble. Absolutely. Don't get me wrong. There's always a place for Western medicine, but I also see the other side. And in my line of thinking, the holistic approach is far more accessible than most of us believe. So if we can sort of wipe the slate clean that it's all woo woo and instead maybe embrace some of it just as a start, do one thing that you don't normally do that doesn't involve taking a pill every morning to try and manage your anxiety and depression. The other thing you mentioned was just this idea of how we ruminate and all of that. I think the underlying issue is we need to really understand that absolutely everything we want, whether it's money, the girlfriend, the pretty house, the vacation, the whatever it is, everything we want already exists in the quantum field. And that is totally accessible to us. And all it's like a magnet, right? Two magnets coming together will either cause those magnets to go and connect or they will repel. So they will push each other away. So who am I being to attract what I want that already exists in the quantum and bring it to me? And the thing is we as people believe that we have to work harder, we have to try harder, we have to get more degrees, we have to do more, do it differently, do it better. And once we do all that, we'll be okay. We will have quote unquote succeeded. And that's just not it. We don't have to work that hard. We really just need to reconnect with our inner selves and touch on the fact that the worry is kind of useless when we're worried about the job and all of that. If we believe that we can access what already exists in the quantum energetic field, we're already on the path to success. But that takes a lot, right? It means that we have to believe in ourselves. We have to believe in something higher than ourselves, whatever that is for you, a higher power, spirit, God, whatever that is for you. It doesn't really matter. But to understand there's something greater than you and I at play here that's managing it all. And inside of understanding that and believing that, at least for me, is a natural calm that it's all going to work out how it's designed to work out. It may not look the way I thought it would or wanted it to, but everything that I am intended to have, do, become is already divinely orchestrated.
Yeah, we're going deep for sure. I'm trying to think of what would be. There's a couple things going in my mind. I love the fact that you said kind of so this idea of almost taking the pressure off yourself and the fact that the worry rarely benefits us. I think that there's again kind of going back to what I talked about with the ruminations is there's this urge in some of the self-help space to think about what you don't want, fight it off, see yourself not dealing with it. I'm not a big law of attraction person, but at the same time, I completely subscribe to the fact that what you focus on expands and feels more real. So if you are saying, I don't want a crappy job. I don't want a relationship with this person that I'm not interested in. I don't want to feel lousy every day. You're magnifying those things, right? It's sort of the happiness trap. People will often say that the more that you say to yourself, I'm unhappy and I want to be happy, the harder it is for you to then generate that happiness because a lot of these things are byproducts, right? So when, to your point, right, the law of attraction piece, it is totally okay for us to have slightly different thoughts here, right? Is the way that I look at it is an alignment thing. When you say, I want X, I want Y, I want Z, I am acting and being in a fashion that aligns with those things, then eventually that alignment is going to sort of overlap or whatever you want to call it. That alignment is going to appear And then you just kind of step into that thing that you want, right? It's if you really want to be a professional baseball player, but you're being an accountant all day, every day, and all you think about is numbers, there's a misalignment there, right? Not only in the actions, but then also the feelings, right? But if you're like, hey, and I'm not saying that just thinking about being a professional baseball player will necessarily get you there, but if you're like, hey, I'm taking the steps to achieve that goal and I see myself doing that and it's just something that I'm excited about, at the very least, that positive emotion is going to drive you forward into more actions that are going to drive you closer to success. I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen, but that alignment is what brings you toward that goal, right? And it's important to stay on that. I think I'm going to open up a can of worms real quick, which is obviously a little bit of a risk, but I don't know if you work at all in the psychedelics space, but I think some of the things that you have said have given me those vibes, right? And I have I've done a little bit of psychedelics myself. They talk about if you do psychedelics with the thought that they are heart medicine, right? They are realigning you to what is in your heart and opening your heart. I think did you call it a heart chakra or a heart?
Well, it is the heart chakra. I work in the quantum energetic field, so I work in the unseen. I always say that I dance in the unseen every day. And yes, we're looking at the energy centers, which are otherwise referred to as the chakras, but we're talking about ancient civilizations having discovered these modalities and the shamans being one of them. But yes, the heart chakra. The heart chakra is the center of our divinity. It's the center of our creative self. We cannot possibly create from a place of survival, which are the lower chakras. The first, second, and third chakras are our survival centers, our procreative selves, our center of our will. This is where we manage life so that things don't fall apart because we're so scared and worried and anxious and depressed. If we're living in those lower energy centers, it's impossible to create from our heart center, which is our center of divinity. Yes.
Yeah. And so it's important to open that back up when possible, right? So I guess the story that I was going to give was I went on a retreat almost 3 years ago now. I went to a place that where you can do this drug called ayahuasca. I mean, it's a crazy experience. I'm not telling folks to go do it, but the election in Massachusetts is tomorrow. I know we talked about that earlier. And actually the psychoactive compound in ayahuasca, which is called DMT, that's actually on the ballot in Massachusetts. So I hope folks have read that question and think about whether or not they want something like that in their state. I'm not offering an opinion. I'm just saying there are and there may be more places where you could potentially tap into these resources should you want them. So I had gone to this retreat and it's there's a lot to unpack here, but what I wanted to talk about was basically we've talked about the heart chakra, we've talked about your energy, we've talked about the stress response. And one theme that kept coming up. So essentially what happens is you take the medicine, that's what they call it, the ayahuasca. You have your own experience and everybody else has their own experience. And then the next day or maybe 6 hours later, you all come together, you talk about what you experienced. Most people see visions, they go on something of a trip, if you will, but it's supposed to open up that heart chakra and get you more aligned with your core essence. And a lot of folks, I'm not going to give specific stories because it's maybe not my place to give those stories, but a lot of folks, the theme was essentially, right, something really bad happened early in their life, or maybe 10 years before that. And then at some point, they found themselves in this high stress state all the time. And when they went on this experience, right, when they did the ceremony, they did the ayahuasca, and they listened to their heart and they reopened, what the medicine, for a lot of them, what it told them was, you went through this thing that was so difficult and so painful that we just had to figure out how to survive. And we, as in being the person, their mind, their psyche, all that, right? And so what ended up happening was, in order to survive, they push that down because it's too large and too difficult. And it kind of makes sense from a standpoint of if I don't know how to work with this, I'll just forget about it or seemingly forget about it. And then they're like, hey, for the last 10 years since that happened, I've been in this high stress state for my whole life. I've had these tics. I don't know what's going on in my body, but something has changed. And for a lot of them, the medicine was like, the reason you have these tics, the reason that you live in this high stress state is because there's this big, big thing living in the shadows of your psyche that you haven't dealt with. And to the mind and to the brain, it can be easier, even though it's really painful, it can be easier to be like, you know what? I would rather deal with the high stress state all the time, this detached high stress state, than go back into that trauma that was really painful and really difficult and that I couldn't resolve. Because the stress, even though it stinks, it keeps your mind's eye away from what's really gnawing away at you on the inside. And so I think I wanted to share that story because it felt like it aligned with a lot of the practices that you do, right? And I don't think, Maggie, that anybody that's listening necessarily needs to do psychedelics or anything like that. A lot of folks will even say there's the default mode network in the brain. And when you had said, when you meditate and you kind of turn your mind off, all these things can sometimes bubble back up to the surface. I guess the folks who are smarter than me, the scientists, will say whether it's meditation or it's DMT or mushrooms or something, all of those things act to turn off that default mode network. And then when that default mode network is turned off, all of a sudden those past traumas, those past hurts come back up. So there are different ways to do this same work. The core theme that I want to put forth here, right, is one way or another, if we think or we feel or know that something is eating away at us from the inside, then we should try to use one of those modalities in order to try to resolve that thing. At the same time, you said earlier, we do have to be a little bit careful, right? We don't want to re-traumatize ourselves. We don't want to go digging for something that isn't there if it's not actually there. But I think the main point is if you're in that high stress state all the time, if you're living in a way that is not bringing you any joy whatsoever, that is probably a sign that there is at least some exploration to do. Once you do that initial exploration and find some initial hints, then from there, figure out how to proceed, whether you say, no, I'm good, or let's keep digging.
Yeah, and that's true, right? Because there are people who end up doing things you're suggesting, and they're not ready for the messages or the trauma, drama, and will drive back up, and that's just not a good idea. And it's not a drug. That's one thing you said I wanted to make sure to say.
Sure.
Ayahuasca is not a drug, and neither are psychedelics. Those are plant medicines, and they are called that because they are. They are medicinal therapies that you can find in nature that the ancient shamans and other traditions discovered thousands of years ago that can help somebody come back to themselves. One of the things we talked about earlier, I just wanted to throw this in there. You were talking about, I can't remember exactly, but you were talking about setting yourself up for success and just the way you think and the way you come at something. I think it's really important to note that if you're on a path to do something or change your life somehow or change your job or whatever, you will know that you are on the right path when synchronicities happen, when everything you do starts to flow. One decision after another is the right decision. When you come up against a roadblock and another roadblock and another roadblock while you're on that path, please take that as a sign that you're not on the right path, because synchronicity is spirit's way to tell you you're on the right track. And so I think that's really, really important. When your life flows with one decision after another, keep going.
Here's a question for you just to play devil's advocate. I'm not saying that I disagree, but just a question. There are some folks who may subscribe to the idea that the world, the universe wants to see how bad you want something. And so maybe it might throw some roadblocks in your way to say, "Hey dude, hey lady, how badly do you want this job? How badly do you want to become the person that you seek to be?" Do you believe in that? Do you subscribe to that at all?
That the roadblocks are actually asking you how hard you want it, how much you want it, how hard you want to try.
Yeah.
Some cases it could be. But when there's more than one synchronicity after another, and every decision you're making just flows along in alignment with your path, take that as a sign that you're on the right track for sure. A roadblock can certainly be helpful as a challenge, but if you have more than one roadblock as you're trying to do something that you really think you want to be doing, I would pay attention personally. I do pay attention personally. And I've had moments like that, but I've also had moments, in fact, very recently, where the synchronicities are undeniable. One after the other, after the other, after the other, which just reaffirms to me you're on the right track. Just keep going. Just keep going.
Yeah, I think if nothing else, to get those synchronicities feels great, and it does. It pushes you along. You're like, yeah, I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So I'm always on the lookout for those. I'm not saying that they always come, but I'm certainly wanting them to.
Well, that's what's important, right? Is that we're paying attention, that we're paying attention to that, that we're not saying, oh, that's just a coincidence, because it's not. It's not a coincidence. There are no accidents. Nothing happens without some kind of reason behind it, just nothing. And so I think it's very, very important that we bring awareness to our lives. And it's come on, how many times do you think about your mom and she calls you, right? 20 minutes later, or your best friend, or whatever, somebody shows up at your door that you've been thinking about for weeks. That's not an accident. That is not an accident. But anyway, so in terms of anxiety and depression, I think we've gone all around the map, and we've woven our ways around a bunch of different topics, which actually I'm sure we could talk about for another couple hours, Brian. But let's basically tell me, or tell our listeners what advice you would give us to be able to live a life illuminated.
Yeah, I think so much of it aligns with what we already talked about, right? I mean, I could go into the, hey, if you're dealing with anxiety, here are a few helpful tips to use in the moment. But if we're talking about living a life illuminated, it's the higher level stuff. It's, are you aware of the path that you want to be on? Are you then on that path? If you are not, what is in the way of you getting on that path? And then if you are on that path, what are you doing to, I guess, kind of motivate yourself to stay on it and keep going? Because I certainly believe that there are synchronicities in life and all that. At the same time, you hear the stories of folks who went after a dream, and it's a star athlete who tore his ACL twice and all that, right? Sometimes it does require a little bit of grittiness and really putting in that hard work. But I think at the end of the day, the most important thing for the illuminated life is thinking about, what do I really want, right? We talked about awareness, and I think, what do you say? The mindful consumption and all that is, if you have that North Star of, I want to be in this certain place or I want to feel this certain way, then that guides your behaviors quite a bit. And it comes with its own nuances, because sometimes people say, I want $1 million, I want a new car, and then I'll be happy, right? I think one of the most important things, this is something, yeah, this is probably how I'll end this, right? Is, there's a song, I'm on the pursuit of happiness, and when I get there, everything will be great or golden or whatever. And it's like, it is not the pursuit of happiness. It is the happiness of the pursuit. When you're doing things that you enjoy, when you are striving towards things that you care about, sure, it absolutely feels good to be like, I achieved that thing and I can celebrate and all that. But the most important thing is to stay on that path that brings you that excitement just in the pursuit itself. Because if you're off on all these other paths and you're like, I'll get back there one day, but right now I'm totally miserable and I'm consuming all this content, you're in a dark and bad place. So stay on the path, get that fulfillment out of just the exploration and the pursuit itself. And then, hey, you never know, you might actually achieve the goal that you want, and that could bring even more happiness. So,
Beautiful. Now, how can people find you, Brian?
yeah, I'd say just go to my website. So that's getoutofyourhead.com, all one word, no dashes, no spaces. On Instagram, same thing, get out of your head. Shoot me a message, drop me an email. Would love to chat. So,
Wonderful. It has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you, and I hope to have you back.
yeah, this was very fun. So,
Yeah. Thanks again.